Something is wrong with their numbers. The sensor log came back 3 times before Senior Scan Officer Wren stopped blaming the equipment. He was aboard the RFS Ardent, a Rithani border frigate assigned to the Vethara corridor, and his job for the last 4 years had been the same quiet routine: sweep the lane, log the traffic, flag anything without a proper transponder signal. It was not exciting work. The corridor was not exciting space. Nothing interesting happened in the Vethara corridor. Until something did. The contact appeared at the edge of detection range, moving without a beacon, without a hail, without any of the 17 standard identification signals required by Imperial Transit Law. Mass reading, heavy. Drive signature, unrecognized. Hull configuration, unresolved. The computer tried to match it against 6,000 registered vessel profiles and came back with a single word in the status field. Unknown. Wren sent the reading to his commanding officer, Sub-Admiral Peth, a careful woman with 30 years of border service and a reputation for never using more words than a situation required. She looked at the reading. She looked at it again. Then she ordered the Ardent to intercept. It was supposed to be simple. The unknown vessel was not accelerating, not evading, not doing anything that suggested it knew it had been seen. Peth brought the frigate up to interdiction range, lit the contact with full active scan, and opened a channel on every standard frequency. Nothing. The contact drifted. The scan data got worse, not better. The closer the Ardent got, the less sense the readings made. The hull was registering as layered in a way the system had no name for. The mass kept shifting in the model depending on which sensor array was doing the calculation. The drive core was generating a heat signature that did not match any known propulsion type, and yet the ship was clearly moving. Peth ordered a tractor lock as a precaution. The tractor locked. The contact's drive signature changed. Not dramatically, there was no flash, no roar, no visible output shift. The numbers simply adjusted and the contact began to move. Not away, toward the Ardent. Steadily, without hurry, as though the tractor was a mild inconvenience rather than a full-power restraint system. No one on the bridge said anything. Peth released the tractor. The contact slowed. It stopped approximately 900 meters off the Ardent's bow and sat there. Then it turned on its lights. Not weapon ports, not targeting arrays. Running lights, the kind of lights a ship uses when it wants to be seen. Amber along the lower hull, white at the bow. A slow pulse at the stern that Wren did not recognize from any standard registry until he ran the pulse sequence through a very old database of pre-imperial contact protocols. It was a greeting signal, an old one. The kind used 200 years ago before radio hails were standardized, when ships crossed paths in the dark and wanted to say, "I see you. I mean nothing hostile. I am here." Peth sent an immediate emergency relay to Fleet Admiral Sovereign Kale at the regional command post in the Dethara system. The relay included the sensor logs, the tractor data, the hull readings, and the image of the unknown vessel sitting quietly in the dark with its amber lights on. She wrote one line of her own at the end of the message. "I do not have a classification for this. I recommend a full response team and someone who speaks to new contacts for a living." Kale received the message 11 minutes later. He read it once, read the sensor logs twice, and looked at the image of the vessel for a long time. It was not a graceful ship. It had the look of something that had been rebuilt repeatedly, panels that did not quite match, hull sections that came from different construction traditions, a silhouette that broke none of the rules of good engineering but followed none of them elegantly either. It looked like something that had survived things. He pulled up the human trade registry because the corridor bordered the edge of the space they used, and he ran the hull configuration against their registered vessel classes. No match. He ran the drive signature. No match. He ran the mass profile. The computer offered a possible match, a class of deep survey vessel that the humans had officially decommissioned a decade ago. Cale looked at the decommissioning date. He looked at the date on Peth's message. He thought about the tractor data and the fact that a full-power restraint system had simply not held. He ordered 6 ships to the Vethara corridor, including 2 with full boarding capacity. He also requested Scholar Envoy Dis from the Imperial Contact Studies Division, because whatever this was, someone was going to have to talk to it eventually, and Cale preferred to talk before anything else became necessary. He sent Peth a reply: hold position, do not attempt further contact, do not fire, wait for the fleet. Then he sat back and looked at the image one more time. The unknown vessel had not moved. Its lights were still on. It was still pulsing that old greeting sequence in the dark, patient as anything, as though it had all the time there was and knew exactly how to use it. Cale had been doing this work for 31 years. He had handled disputed contacts, hostile incursions, 3 separate species making their first unplanned appearance in Imperial space, and one event that still had no official name in the records. He had never looked at a sensor image and felt, without being able to explain why, that the ship was waiting for him specifically. He told himself that was not a useful thought. He began preparing the fleet orders anyway. Classification error. The Relentless had a smell. That was the first thing Scholar Envoy Dis noticed when he crossed the docking collar into the human vessel. Not the layout, not the equipment, not the crew standing at a respectful distance watching him with expressions that were professionally neutral and personally very curious. The smell. Something between machine oil, burned metal, and something organic he could not place. It was not unpleasant. It was simply present, the way the smell of a place that has been worked in for a long time is present. The ship smelled like it had a history. Dis had reviewed what files existed on the human vessel during the 3-hour transit from the Ardent to the point where the fleet had formally established a perimeter. The files were thin. A hull registration number that came back as belonging to a class of military survey ship the human government had officially taken out of service 11 years prior. A name, ISV Relentless, that appeared in 3 separate incident reports from the human colonial period, and a brief mention in a trade registry update from 6 years ago, listed under current operators as a private deep survey company called OSI Navigation, registered in a place called Accra. That was everything. The Empire's database on human vessels covered 412 registered types. The Relentless was not one of them. The crew had agreed to a formal inspection. Dis understood, from the way the agreement had been worded by the human commander over the fleet channel, that it was not a concession, it was an invitation. There was a difference, and the commander, a woman named Dara Osai, had made it audible without making it hostile. She met him at the collar personally. She was not tall for a human, which meant she came to approximately Dis's shoulder. She wore a plain gray shipsuit with no rank insignia he could identify, and she shook his hand in the human contact greeting before he had a chance to offer the Rithani formal bow, which suggested she had done some reading of her own. She said, "Welcome aboard, I'll walk you through myself, ask whatever you need to ask." He asked about the smell first, because it was the thing he was most curious about, and experience had taught him that starting with the genuine question was always faster. She told him the environmental system recycled through a biological filter bank on the lower deck algae cultures that had been running continuously for 14 years. They were better than the mechanical filters at handling long-haul air quality, she said. The ship had originally used standard mechanical systems. They had been replaced after a 6-month deep survey run during which 2 crew members had developed respiratory problems. Dis noted this in his field log and did not say what he was thinking, which was, the mechanical systems failed, so they grew a solution. She took him to the engine section next. The drive core occupied a space that, in a vessel of comparable mass in the Rithani registry, would have held a secondary cargo bay. It was not a small installation. Engineer First Class Ryo Adebio was waiting there. A large man who had the particular quality Dis had observed in certain kinds of specialists, of being entirely relaxed in a space that was entirely his. Ryo explained the drive in the way experts explain things to people they have decided are worth the effort, directly, without simplification, but also without the performance of complexity that some technicians used as a way of avoiding real questions. The core was a hybrid configuration, a standard human commercial drive married to a secondary system that used the waste heat from the primary as an input rather than venting it. The secondary system added approximately 40% to total output under sustained burn and required, he said, tolerances that most manufacturers would not certify. Dis asked who had certified it. Ryo said they had run the tests themselves, and the ship had not exploded, which was the relevant data point. Dis wrote in his log, "They built this because the standard version was not enough, and they could not afford a new one." Tactical Officer Nadia Vassal walked him through the hull next. She was concise in a way that Dis appreciated. She did not explain what she was showing him. She simply showed him, and let the evidence reach its own conclusions. The outer hull had 4 distinct construction layers, each from a different period of the ship's history. The outermost was a ceramic composite material that did not appear in any Rithani materials catalog. When Dis asked about it, Vassal said it had originally been developed to protect mining equipment from micro-impact in high-debris fields. Someone had tested it on a hull section. It had performed well enough that they had covered the entire exterior. Dis ran his scanner over it. The reading was remarkable. The material was not designed to stop weapons fire. It was designed to absorb repeated low-level impacts indefinitely without degrading. Under weapons fire, it would not hold, but it would absorb a substantial fraction of the energy from any single hit before transferring load to the structural frame, which was itself 3 generations of reinforcement over the original military spec. The ship had not been designed to be indestructible. It had been designed to take damage and continue. There was a difference, and Dis understood it, and he stood in the corridor between the outer hull section and the crew quarters and looked at his scanner readout for a moment longer than was professionally necessary. Dr. Priya Suresh found him there. She was the ship's physician, a small woman with steady hands and the kind of attention that made you feel she had already noticed the 3 most important things about you and was simply waiting to see if you would mention them yourself. She asked if he was all right. He said he was recalibrating. She said, "That happens a lot when people look at this ship for the first time." He asked her what she meant. She said, "People expect a ship to look like what it was designed to be. The Relentless looks like what it's had to become." She paused. "Those are different ships." Dis filed his first interim report to Admiral Kale that evening. It was 4 pages long. The summary at the top was 1 sentence. The database classification is not wrong because the data is missing. It is wrong because the category does not exist. The weight of the hull. Dis did not sleep much that night. He lay in the small quarters the humans had given him, clean, practical, slightly too warm by Rithani standards, and read through everything the Imperial Archives held on human spaceflight history. He had skimmed it before. He read it properly now. The first century of human space travel was not a story of progress. It was a story of loss. Ships that did not come back. Colonies that went silent. Drives that failed in deep transit with no recovery possible. The humans had lost, by his count, over 4,000 spacefaring personnel in the first 40 years alone, and they had kept going. Not because the losses stopped. Because they built ships that were more likely to return than the ones before. And then those ships told them what they needed to fix next. Their engineering tradition was not built on theory first. It was built on wreckage. Dis read until the ship's ambient lighting shifted to indicate morning cycle. Then he went to find Ryo Adebyo. The engineer was already in the drive section, which Dis suspected was simply where Ryo existed when not required elsewhere. He had a panel open on the secondary system housing and was doing something with a diagnostic tool that looked less like a standard calibration and more like a conversation. Dis asked if he could continue asking questions. Ryo said the ship didn't charge for answers, which Dis understood after a moment was a joke. He asked Ryo how long it had taken to develop the hybrid drive configuration. Ryo thought about it in the way people think about questions they have never needed to put into words before. He said the original idea came from a paper written by a drive engineer named HFY, who had been working on long-haul commercial vessels and got tired of watching ships vent usable energy because the recapture systems were too expensive to certify through standard channels. HFY had published the theory. No manufacturer had built it. The economics did not work at production scale. Ryo said he had read the paper during a 2-year posting on a fuel station at the edge of the Kuiper Belt, where there was very little to do and a great deal of time to think. When he joined the Relentless 7 years ago, the ship's primary drive was failing in ways that a standard replacement couldn't fix without a full hull redesign. So he went back to HFY's paper. Dis asked how long it took to build. Ryo said, 11 months, 2 of us. We had the primary stripped down to frame for 4 of those months, so the ship wasn't going anywhere. He tapped the housing. 3rd time running it, we got the tolerances right. She's been on this configuration for 6 years. Dis asked, what happened the first 2 times? Ryo said, first time the recapture coupling failed under load and we lost about 3 days of work. Second time it ran for 40 seconds and then the pressure differential in the secondary threw a seal. He paused. We were docked both times. Nobody got hurt. I count that as success criteria. Dis wrote in his log, they defined success as the failure happening in a controlled environment. They build the test conditions into the process. Later that morning, Nadia Vassal took him to the bow observation section, a small compartment at the forward point of the ship that was not on any deck plan he had been given. The floor was transparent. The walls were transparent. It was a room built entirely of the same ceramic composite that covered the outer hull, and sitting inside it was like sitting in space with a ship around you somewhere behind. Vassal said the compartment had been added during the second rebuild, after the original observation port had failed during a debris field transit. Instead of replacing the port, the previous chief engineer had replaced the entire bow section. Dis looked at the stars through the floor. The fleet was visible, 6 Rithani vessels in their standard intercept pattern, lights clean and ordered in the dark. They were, by any standard measure, more powerful than the Relentless, more modern, better armed. He asked Vassal what she saw when she looked at the fleet. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, straight lines, matching parts, ships built in a yard by people who knew exactly what they were making before they started. She did not say it as a criticism. She said it as an observation. He asked what she saw when she looked at the Relentless. She said, a record of every problem we solved. That afternoon, Dr. Suresh took Dis to the medical bay for what she called an exchange of information. She wanted to understand Rithani biology as it related to long-haul space travel. He was willing to share. What he had not expected was how much she would share in return. She told him about the early colony ships, the medical failures that came from not understanding what sustained microgravity did to bone density over 18-month transits. The crews that arrived at destinations physically diminished. The solutions that were developed not in research facilities, but by ship's doctors who had patients in front of them and limited resources and no choice but to figure it out. She showed him the current medical system aboard the Relentless, a combination of standard pharmaceutical stock, a small fabrication unit for basic compounds, and a biological monitoring suite that tracked every crew member in real time and built individual baselines rather than using species average references. She said, we learned early that averages get people killed. People are not average. Dis thought about the imperial medical standards aboard fleet vessels, which used species average protocols and reviewed them every 10 years at the academic level. He did not say what he was thinking. He asked her how many crew the Relentless currently carried. She said 9. He asked how many people had served on the ship over its operational life. She thought for a moment and said, 41 over 22 years, 3 deaths all in the first 5 years, none since the second rebuild. Dis wrote, they measure progress in the people who came home. He sent his second interim report to Kale that evening. It was longer than the first. The summary read, Admiral, I do not think this vessel is an anomaly. I think this vessel is what their engineering tradition produces when it has enough time and enough necessity. The question is not what this ship is. The question is how many more like it exist. He did not receive a reply that night. What he received, at the 3rd hour of dark cycle, was a fleet-wide alert that 2 additional Rithani warships had arrived in the corridor, with new orders from the Imperial Advisory Council. He read the orders. He sat with them for a long time. Then he went to find Dr. Suresh, because he thought someone on the human crew should hear what was coming from someone who was not delivering it as an ultimatum, the Empire's answer. The council relay reached Kale at the same time as Dis's second report, and he read both in the same sitting, which meant he read them against each other. Dis's report said, this ship is not a threat, it is a result. The council's orders said, detain the vessel and crew pending full intelligence review, and if compliance is refused, treat the vessel as a hostile incursion. Kale read both documents twice. Then he sat for a while doing nothing, which was something he did when the gap between what the data said and what he was being told to do with it was wide enough to require its own consideration. The problem with the council's position was not that it was unreasonable on its face. An unidentified vessel of unknown capability appearing in Imperial corridor space was, by definition, a security concern. The standard response was documented, tested, and legally clear. Detain, assess, release, or escalate. It was good procedure. The problem was that the procedure assumed the vessel in question could be detained. Kale had watched the tractor data from the Ardent 11 times. He had run the numbers on what a full-power restraint lock from a border frigate should do to a vessel of comparable mass, and then he had watched the sensor record of the Relentless, simply deciding the tractor was inconvenient and moving away from it. Not breaking it, the tractor had not failed. The ship had applied drive output sufficient to overcome the lock without the lock registering a failure state, which meant the output had been applied gradually enough that the system never detected a threshold violation. The ship had not forced its way free, it had walked out. Commander Leth arrived at Kale's briefing room with the posture of someone who had already decided what he thought and was present as a formality. Leth was young for his rank, which was a consequence of wartime promotion and a genuinely sharp tactical mind. He was also, Kale had observed, the kind of person who found uncertainty uncomfortable and tended to resolve it by reaching a conclusion early and defending it. His conclusion was that the Relentless was a covert military asset operating under commercial cover, that the crew's cooperative behavior was a stalling tactic, and that the appropriate response was immediate detention by force if necessary. Kale asked Leth what he thought would happen if they attempted a forced boarding. Leth said the vessel would comply or be disabled. Kale asked him what the tractor data suggested about the probability of disabling the vessel. Leth said the tractor data was from a single border frigate, not a coordinated fleet action. Kale said, 8 vessels, coordinated, full tractor array. You want to try to hold a ship that walked through a single lock with 8 locks at once in a corridor that borders their space with their government watching. Leth said the council had issued clear orders. Kale said, the council issued orders. I'm asking you what you think happens next. Leth did not have a ready answer for that, which meant he had not thought past the execution of the orders to the consequences of them, which was a habit Kale had been trying to correct in him for 2 years. On the Relentless, the detention order arrived as a standard fleet channel communication addressed to the commanding officer. Dara Os received it, read it once, and told Ryo to run a full systems check. Ryo asked what kind of systems check. She said the kind you run when you might need everything to work at the same time. He said he could have that done in 40 minutes. She said, "You've got 30. Nadia was already in the tactical section. She had been there since Dis left to send his second report, because Nadia had a habit of being in the tactical section when external events were moving in directions she hadn't chosen. She was running geometry, the positions of all 8 Rithani vessels, the corridor topology, the mass and drive data she had gathered from passive scans since the fleet arrived. She knew, with the kind of precision that came from doing this work in asteroid belts, where the margin for error was the difference between alive and not, exactly what the space around them looked like, and exactly what each of those ships could do. She also knew what the Relentless could do, which was the more relevant calculation. She did not like where the numbers were going. Dara came to the tactical section and stood next to her and looked at the display. She did not ask Nadia to explain it. She let Nadia point to the things that mattered. Nadia said, "If they try a full tractor array, we can break it. Drive output versus combined lock force. We clear in about 90 seconds, and we're out of the corridor in 4 minutes at full burn." Dara asked what the Rithani fleet would do in those 4 minutes. Nadia said, "Their fastest ship gets within weapons range in about 3.5 minutes, so they'd have a 30-second window." Dara asked what the Relentless could take in 30 seconds. Nadia said, "Depends what they're shooting." Dara nodded. She looked at the display for another moment, and then she said the thing that Nadia had been waiting to hear, because Nadia had not been able to say it herself and had needed someone else to say it first. Dara said, "We're not running." Nadia said, "I know." Dara said, "Running makes this a provocation. Running makes everything Dis told Kale about us disappear. They remember the thing that ran, not the thing that cooperated." Nadia said, "So what do we do?" Dara said, "We answer the hail. We acknowledge the detention order. We tell them we are prepared to continue the inspection process and await clarification of the legal basis for extended detention under the Pre-Imperial Transit Compact of 2271, which is the only relevant framework that applies to corridor space and which the Rithani signed." Nadia looked at her. "You have the treaty article ready." Dara said, "I've had it ready since they showed up." Nadia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And if they don't care about the treaty?" Dara said, "Then we find out what they're actually made of." She went to send the reply. Nadia looked back at the display and ran the geometry one more time, not because the numbers had changed, but because it was what she did when she needed to feel like she understood the space she was in. The numbers were the same. The space was the same. The 8 ships were still there, arranged in their careful pattern around the Relentless. The Relentless sat in the middle of them and did not move. Its lights were still on, what they couldn't model. The 2 additional warships that arrived in the corridor were called the Vreth and the Solen, and they were not border patrol vessels. They were second-line combat ships, the kind the Empire deployed when it wanted a situation resolved rather than observed. Their commander was a man named Tor Vane, who held the rank of battle coordinator and had been given operational authority over the interdiction by the council faction that had decided Kale was moving too slowly. Vane had reviewed Dis's reports and found them interesting in the way he found most academic work interesting, which was to say he acknowledged they were probably accurate and did not think they changed the core question, which was, what does this vessel do if we require it to comply? He gave the Relentless a formal ultimatum over the fleet channel. comply with boarding and detention within 1 standard hour, or face disabling fire. The response came back in 11 minutes. It was from Dara Osai. It was 3 paragraphs long and cited, in precise detail, the transit compact provision that applied to corridor space contacts, the standard Rithani procedure for contested detentions, and the specific articles that required a legal review before disabling fire could be authorized in non-hostile contact situations. It was, Vane told Leth, a delay tactic. Leth said he agreed. Kale, reading the same transmission, said nothing. He had pulled up the transit compact. The citations were correct, every one of them. He sent a private message to Dis asking how the human commander had obtained a current copy of the Rithani transit compact. Dis replied that she had likely had it for some time, and that in his assessment, the crew had prepared for this encounter more carefully than anyone had considered. Kale thought about what that meant. A commercial deep survey vessel operating on the edge of imperial space, crewed by people who had studied the relevant law before they ever arrived, not as a legal trick, as preparation, as the same instinct that had put biological filters in the air system and ceramic composite on the hull, the instinct that said, know the environment you are entering and know how to survive it. Vane authorized a demonstration shot, not a disabling round, a single impact on the bow section, enough to show the relentless that the ultimatum was real. Leth relayed the order to the Vreth. The shot hit the relentless on the forward port section. Dis, watching from inside the ship, felt nothing. No vibration, no sound, no alarm. Dr. Suresh looked up from the diagnostic she was running and raised one eyebrow. Ryo's voice came over the internal channel and said the outer layer had absorbed most of it and the structural reading was nominal. On the Vreth, the post-shot assessment showed a mark on the hull and a thermal dissipation reading that the weapons officer looked at twice before reporting it. The ceramic composite had spread the impact energy across a surface area approximately 40 times the contact point. The underlying structure had received less than 8% of the shot's rated force. Vane received the assessment, he read it, he looked at it again. He authorized a full disabling shot, rated to take a vessel of the Relentless's class out of drive operation. This time Dis felt it. A low shudder, like something large and far away had decided to disagree with the ship's existence. Ryo's voice came back on channel, faster this time, running through the damage list with the particular speed of someone who had rehearsed for exactly this scenario. Outer composite degraded on port forward section, secondary structural layer intact, drive output at 94%, all systems nominal. 94%. The ship had taken a full disabling shot and lost 6% of its drive output. The fleet channel went quiet. Not the quiet of a pause, but the quiet of a group of professionals simultaneously recalibrating. Nadia's voice came over the internal channel. Want me to show them what 94% looks like? Dara said no. She opened the fleet channel herself. Her voice was the same as it had been in every prior transmission, level, unhurried, precise. She said, Fleet Commander Vane, you have now discharged 2 weapons against a vessel that has not threatened you, has not moved against you, and has been engaged in active legal dialogue with your command. I want to note for the record that this ship is still here. I want to note for the record that its crew is unharmed. I want to note for the record that we have not returned fire and have no intention of doing so. I am requesting, formally, that you open a direct channel to Admiral Kale, who I believe has the authority to conduct this conversation appropriately. Silence. Then Vane said on a private channel to Kale, Admiral, your assessment. Kale said, she's right about the legal citations, she's right about the procedure, she's right that I have the authority. He paused. She's also right that they're still there. Vane said nothing. Kale said, Battle Coordinator, I am resuming command of this contact. Please stand down your weapons. Another silence, longer. Vane said, "Admiral, the Council's orders." Kale said, "The Council ordered a detention. We cannot detain this vessel. What we can do is talk to it. That is what I intend to do." He removed Leth from the communication station, not as a punishment, but because Leth had been running arguments in his head for the last 4 hours, and Kale needed someone next to him who was listening instead of arguing. He opened a direct channel to Dara Osai. He said in her language, without any preamble or formal title, "I would like to talk. I think we have both been standing in the same room for 2 days and not actually speaking to each other yet." There was a pause on her end. Then she said, in his language which she spoke without an accent, "I have been ready since we arrived." In the Relentless's medical bay, Dis sat across from Dr. Suresh and said, "I want you to know that what just happened was not what I recommended." She said, "I know." He said, "What I recommended was patience." She said, "That's what we've been practicing." He looked at his hands for a moment. Then he said, "Your ship took 2 direct hits and is at 94% operational capacity." She said, "Ryo will have it back to full by morning." Dis said, "That is not what I mean." She said, "I know what you mean." Outside, the corridor was quiet. The 8 Rithani ships held their positions. The Relentless sat at the center of the formation, unhurried and lit, and waited for the conversation that was already beginning, the new record. Kale came aboard the Relentless alone. That was not protocol. Protocol required a formal delegation, security personnel, an official recording officer, and a pre-agreed agenda submitted in writing. Kale sent his aide a message that said, "No delegation," and left before anyone could argue with him. He came through the docking collar in his duty uniform with no sidearm and nothing in his hands. Dara met him in the same corridor where she had met Dis, and she was also alone, and she shook his hand the same way before he could offer the Rithani bow, which meant she had made the same calculation twice, and it was not an accident. She took him to the ship's forward observation room, the one Nadia had shown Dis, where the floor was transparent and the stars were directly below your feet. He looked down at the fleet through the floor and said, "You picked this room deliberately." She said, "It's the best room on the ship." He said, "It also shows me my own fleet from underneath, which makes them look less impressive than they do from the command seat." She said, "That's also true." They stood there for a moment. Then he sat down on the low bench along the wall, and she sat across from him, and they had the conversation that should have happened 2 days earlier if the corridor had not been full of people managing their own institutional pressures. He said, "I want to know what it would take to correct the last 48 hours. She said, "That depends on which parts you want to correct." He said, "The parts that could follow us into the next decade." She said, "Corridor access, formal, not a temporary transit permit, a standing agreement under the compact, documented, bilateral with review rights if either party has concerns." She paused. "And a copy of the Rithani stellar cartography for the sectors that border our space." He said, "The cartography is considered sensitive." She said, "We're going there anyway. I'd rather not find things by accident." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The cartography is going to require council approval." She said, "I can wait." He said, "You understand this is not a full resolution. The council faction that wanted this ship detained doesn't disappear because I had a conversation." She said, "I know. I'm not asking for the Empire to change its mind overnight. I'm asking for a document that exists, that both sides have signed, that makes the next encounter start from a different place than this one did." Kale looked at the stars. One of his ships was visible off to the left, its running lights moving in the slow patrol pattern. A Rithani ship, following Rithani procedure, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Solid and certain and entirely unprepared for what it had encountered in this corridor. He said, Your ship took 2 weapons discharges and is at full operational capacity this morning. She said Ryo had a good night. He said, I'm asking because I need to understand what I'm going to tell the people who issued those orders. She said, tell them the ship was built by people who expected things to go wrong and designed accordingly. Tell them that's not a weapon. It's an engineering philosophy. He said, they will want to know if there are more ships like this. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, there are no ships exactly like this one. Ryo built most of what makes it unusual. She paused. But the philosophy is not unusual. Every long-haul crew that's been out past the supply lines for more than 2 years starts solving problems the same way. You use what you have. You don't throw things away when they break. You learn why they broke and you fix that. He said, the imperial engineering tradition works from certified specifications. She said, I know, it builds excellent ships. She looked at him. We couldn't afford excellent, so we built something else. Cale drafted the corridor agreement on a standard data pad and sent it to his ship for the formal communications record. It was 3 pages. It covered access rights, mutual notification protocols, inspection procedures, and a provision for a joint review committee that would meet once per year and which Dis had been informally nominated to chair, a fact Dis did not yet know. The cartography provision was left as an attached memorandum marked pending council review, which was the honest version of what it was. Dara signed it. He signed it. They did not shake hands again. It was not that kind of document. It was a working agreement between 2 parties who had just had a difficult introduction and had decided to keep talking anyway. Nadia found Leth at the docking collar as Cale was preparing to leave. He had come without announcement, which she suspected was its own kind of statement. He was standing in the collar looking at the hull plating of the Relentless, the section that had taken the disabling shot. The outer composite was damaged, a wide shallow mark, the material darkened and slightly compressed, but unbroken. He said, how do you build a hull that does that? She said, you build it out of something that was designed for a different problem, and you test it until you know what it does. He said, no formal certification. She said, we ran our own tests. He said, and if the tests had failed? She said, then we would have known not to use it. She paused. The first crew that tested it knew that going in. They did it anyway because the alternative was continuing to use the material they had, which had already failed twice. Leth looked at the mark on the hull for another moment. He said, I recommended the second shot. She said, I know. He said, I was wrong about what would happen. She said, yeah. He looked at her, that's all you're going to say. She said, what else do you want me to say? You had bad data and you reached a conclusion. When the data corrected itself, you stood in a corridor looking at the evidence. That's more than some people do. He left without another word. She was not sure if that was a good sign or not, and she decided it was not her problem to resolve. Cale departed the Relentless 40 minutes after arriving. The docking collar disengaged. The corridor was quiet. Ryo came to the observation room where Dara was still sitting. He had the post-repair diagnostic on a pad, and he set it down next to her without comment. She looked at it. Full operational status across all systems. The composite section that had taken the hit was flagged for long-term monitoring but structurally intact. He sat down on the bench. He looked at the stars through the floor. He said, where are we going next? She pulled up the navigation display and looked at the corridor agreement, and the memorandum attached to it about the cartography, and the general shape of the space that was now, formally, open to them. She said, there's a system 3 days from here that the Rithani charts mark as surveyed but no one has visited in 60 years. Dis gave me the coordinates before he left, said it was worth a look. Ryo said, Dis gave us Rithani chart coordinates. She said off the record, as a personal observation. Ryo was quiet for a moment, then he said, that's interesting. She said, "That's what I thought." She filed the route and the Relentless moved out of the formation and into open space, and the 8 Rithani ships held their positions and watched it go, and no one gave an order to follow, and no one opened a weapons lock, and the corridor behind them was still and empty and exactly as mapped. In the Imperial database, a new entry was created that evening. The vessel name field read, ISV Relentless. The classification field read, Non-Standard Deep Survey Human Registry Unresolved Category. The status field read, Active. And at the bottom of the entry in the notes section that was usually left blank, someone had written 4 words. Do not underestimate again. It was not signed.